All righty, people. We are back for another episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast. Before we get into the topic of the day, oh, Amy, my darling, I have a gift for you.
Oh, God. Okay.
It's not going to be as good as the ranch story from the Candida episode. That was just gold. But I found this little ditty on Facebook Memories from 2011, and I thought you as a nutrition professional would really enjoy this.
Okay.
I'm going to credit my colleague, Alec Cole. He's a chiropractor in Southern California. Go look him up if you want. Alec wrote this little ditty for a nutrition class that we were in. I believe this was for like a group project or something. Please keep in mind that this is not a natural skill set for me, so feel free to laugh at the performance you're about to witness. However, I would like to point out that I tried to be a badass for this episode, so I wore my Shiitake Just Got Real t-shirt. So also bear that in mind when grading my performance. Are you ready, Amy?
I'm ready.
Can you give me like a beat, like
a beat?
beatbox, like
oh God.
We're gonna go 7 kcal per gram is better than 4. That's why I don't eat carbs or protein no more. Just alcohol and fat, 7 to 9. Plus, I'm guaranteed to always have a really good time. Thank you.
Excellent. Wow.
Credit to Alec Cole, DC, chiropractor in Southern California.
I'm thoroughly embarrassed by my performance, but
no, that was perfect. I feel like you added.
You know what I like, because I was focusing on the beatboxing, I didn't pay attention to a word you were saying. I was like, gotta keep my beat.
Oh no, okay. Then I'll just read it. I'll do this now as a dramatic reading rather than a rap, although it was intended as a rap.
This is something that I do too. I don't know what weird brain lesion it is, where I focus very intensely on my handshake. I don't know what weird thing got implanted into my brain where I have to like have a good handshake with someone. So like pay like really close attention to the handshake that I don't remember the names. It's like the names just.
I feel like that's not something women generally care about. That's more of like a dude thing. I
don't know. I don't. You know what it is? I think I read a book when I was in business school, and it was nonverbal communication. It was all about nonverbal communication, and they made a huge deal about handshakes, and I was like, wow. I think from that point, I was like, I have to really nail this handshake because...
Well, when we meet in person this summer, I fully expect a 10 out of 10 handshake from you then. How about that?
I have a good handshake, but again, I think I need to think less about the handshake and more about remembering the names of people.
That's fair. Were you the kid, like, when you had reading in school where they would, like, one kid reads a paragraph, then another kid reads a paragraph, then another kid reads a paragraph, and you went through the room? Were you the kid who, like, counted ahead and figured out which paragraph was going to be yours, and then you, like, read it ahead of time to practice, but then you weren't paying attention to what the other kids were reading?
Oh, probably 100%. I know we've talked about how, like, and this is probably just how our brains are wired differently. My brain is a little bit more wired from like the OCD anxiety realm, where like I remember you saying you would blow through tests.
Oh yeah,
you'd be the first one.
No
done.
second guessing. I either know it or I don't.
I am the opposite of that, where I'm like, I think I can figure this one out, or ooh, I think it's this. Like my gut's saying this, but what if it's this? Like I would be the longest. I'd almost always be like one of the last ones, if not the last one.
So to further this rabbit trail off the rabbit trail. My best friend in college was the slowest test taker in our class, and I was the fastest test taker, and we lived together and we carpooled. So that meant that I would finish with the test, and then I'd have to go wait for her for like 2 hours to finish her freaking exam. And children, this is before the age of smartphones. I had a flip phone. I had like a Nokia or a Motorola crappy old flip phone. So I didn't have anything to do unless I brought a book with me or if I made actual phone calls in the hallway. But I didn't get my first smartphone. I got a BlackBerry my first year of grad school. So undergrad.
What about like an iPod? Did you have an iPod?
I did have an iPod. Yeah. Okay. So maybe I listened to music. But anyway, I was bored out of my mind every single exam because I was just out there in the hallway twiddling my thumbs waiting for Paige. But anyway, going back to the original rabbit trail, and then eventually we'll get on to the topic of the day, but this is very valuable insight here. So the poetry of the lyrics goes, 7 kcal per gram is better than 4. That's why I don't eat carbs or protein no mo. Just alcohol and fat, 7 to 9. Plus, I'm guaranteed to always have a really good time.
Oh my gosh.
Isn't that just poetry?
That is straight slam poetry right there.
Right. And see, this is why I wore the Shiitake Got Real
Wow.
t-shirt, because I felt like I needed something to kind of go with the badassery of the reading.
You did. And you did.
Mwah.
You killed it.
Mwah.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I will take full credit, obviously. Now, solid 5-6 minutes into the episode, would you like to talk about the actual topic of the day? I'm going to title this one The Magic Ratio. Making up that name completely. I don't think anybody else has referred to it as the magic ratio, but what are the two things in the ratio that we're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I think the way I frame it is how much doing are you doing versus how much research are you doing in the IBS?
You didn't say the actual things though. So it's the information to action ratio is what we're actually talking about.
Right. Why don't you take it away then?
You were explaining first and then revealing. I was thinking like reveal first, then explain. So just different taste. But no, you go ahead. I didn't mean to step on feet, but I was like, wait, you didn't tell them what the thing is, Amy.
Yeah. I think again, like usually the thing that we see in our patients and client populations is that people are taking in so much information, but they're doing less execution of the things that they're learning. And usually, again, I would say that most of the people that have an imbalanced ratio here are going to be the individuals that maybe have a little bit more anxiety or, that want certainty. Like they want to know that they're doing the exactly right thing and that they're doing the right diets and that they're doing the right lifestyle interventions or supplements. And in reality, I think a lot of times the actions actually create clarity as to what's going to work for you, no matter how much information you collect. There's always going to be experimentation that you have to move through. So it can be tricky because, you always hear information or education is power, things like that. And it's like, well, that's true. We want to have a certain amount of information. But a lot of times people are so overloaded with information that they're confused. They don't know which direction to go. And this person says this thing, this person says another thing. And a lot of times it just comes down to like going with your gut on the information of like, oh, this seems like the credible option. I'll give it a try and see if it works for me. I think this is a huge issue for people that we work with because, again, it's how much information is useful is a really important question. And then, understanding that you're still going to be learning even as you're acting and executing the information. It doesn't just end either, if that makes sense.
Well, maybe even more so, right? Like,
right.
Honestly, I'm at the point, I hope this is okay to say this. I don't think it's rocket science to try to interpret like a GI map or a SIBO breath test or a Candida test or something like that. And it's also not tremendously difficult. It's time consuming, but not difficult to listen to a million podcasts, ironically, like our own, watch a million YouTube videos, ironically, like my own, do all the summits. Like those are time consuming, but not difficult. It's more difficult to actually suck it up and do it in your life. Like, okay, you heard 5 different podcasters tell you that sleep is important for the gut, but like, when are you actually going to put the phone down and work on your sleep hygiene and work on your sleep schedule, right? Like, do you really need more information to take action on that thing? And I agree with you. I think that people who are more into like the accrual of knowledge, and I've even heard it called procrastinating, which I think is the most perfect way to put this. Like people who are doing that, oftentimes there is more of an OCD anxiety slant to what's going on with them, right? Because it's the brain saying, but what if, but what if, but what if? And they want absolute certainty that they're doing the right thing. And that absolute certainty doesn't exist. So It's like you're scratching an itch that can never be satisfied. You're never going to get to the bottom of the well and realize that you finally accrued all of the knowledge on Candida on planet Earth. You're done. You are the world's leading expert in Candida. You totally know what to do now. Okay, now take it. Like that doesn't happen. There's always going to be gajillions of research articles that you've never read. herbs that you've never tried, like books that you haven't read, but it feels like you can keep seeking this quest for more knowledge, and it feels like eventually you're going to be satisfied, and then that's when you get to take action.
Yeah, I like that you bring up procrastination because, like you said, a lot of times procrastination is the flip side of perfectionism in some way, where, again, you're trying to perfect your strategy, and it's like, one, again, there's no perfect diet that's going to be right for everybody. There's no perfect supplement. There's no perfect plan for SIBO. Even again, like we've talked about protocols, it's like you could do all this digging into the perfect protocol, but you still wouldn't necessarily do well on that protocol, even if you put in all the information, all the research that you could possibly find, like this makes the most sense. It still might not work for you. And again, that's why I think it's so important to be open to experimentation and know that no matter how much information you gather, like you're saying, there's going to be some level of trial and error, figuring out again what works for you, what doesn't. And acting and taking action, like we've been alluding to, just creates a lot more clarity around what works and what doesn't. And again, I find that people that are more mentally flexible in that way, where they're open to experimentation and open to taking action, versus sometimes, I'll work with people where they're like, we'll be working on different things, and then all of a sudden it'll come up in a session like, well, I've been researching this thing, and it's something totally out of the blue that's sort of a different thing that I wouldn't even anticipate being a bigger problem at that time. It's a lower priority item or something that I would maybe tackle later if ever. And so it's like, no, we're not going to go off like track. This is kind of the plan based on the analysis that we've already laid out. Like, let's sort of play out what makes the most sense to prioritize on my end. And again, we can adjust, but you're throwing in another element when we haven't even tackled the things that are the most obvious.
And I might have a good analogy for this, actually, that just popped into my brain, because I see this with people too.
Yeah.
Even much to my surprise, I even see this in FODMAP Freedom, where I lay out like step by step, step 1, step 2, step 3, and I reinforce every single week in the Q&As, you need to go in order. Like, don't bother tackling the stuff in module 9 until you really dialed in the stuff in module 1, 2, 3, right? Like, and I'm repeating that over and over and over. And still, inevitably, somebody's going to say, oh, well, I think like histamine is a much bigger deal, which is module 9. Like, oh, I think histamine is a much bigger deal for me than my blood sugar. It's like, no, the blood sugar is way bigger of a deal. But the analogy that I just thought of was, it's kind of like if you were getting ready to train for a marathon, right? Like, what would the order of operations be? First, you would need to buy the sneakers. Then you would need to start doing some sort of you would need to start running a little bit. Then you would need to run a lot. And then if you get really, really into it, like maybe before your race, you could start thinking about, oh, maybe I need like these special running shorts that like won't chafe me in a particular way. And maybe I need to like put Band-Aids on my nipples. By the way, I've never run a marathon. I'm just going with what I know from like pop culture. Or like, oh, I need to help my family make the poster that they're going to hold up at the halfway mark to like cheer me on and motivate me,
Right.
And like, oh, I'll get some of those athletic electrolyte energy goo, and I'll have like a packet of goo in my sports bra, and I'll have that midway through the race. Obviously, buying the sneakers and starting to actually run are way more important than shopping for flavors of energy goo. But it's almost like when people come to us and they're like, oh, but I think I need to work on hormones or histamine, and totally ignore poor nutrition or blood sugar regulation or like some of these deal breakery things,
Right.
or sleep or stress or whatever. It's almost like they're saying, no, I don't need the sneakers. I'm going to buy the energy goo first. And then they're like, well, why am I not winning marathons?
Right. They're focusing on the things that could get them maybe 10% there instead of the 90%. Like, they're focusing on not the fundamentals, not the unsexy basics. They're kind of focusing on things that a lot of times fall into place if you focus on the basic stuff, and might need like some very minor tweaking towards the end. But I think that there's usually a process that makes sense. And sometimes people sort of veer outside the process, or they hear some new tidbit or hear about a new supplement. And it's like, oh, let's do this. And it's like, no, we have a plan and we can deviate from the plan if it makes sense. But usually if I'm deviating from like my process or like a specific plan, it's because of how someone's doing with the actions that they're taking. So typically, I have a priority list of like, oh, this is top priorities, next priority. And like, usually if I'm deviating a little bit or individualizing more and more, it's just because this person's struggling in this area and maybe we need a little extra support, or, oh, we need to change up this part of the plan. But it's usually not like this curveball thing that's, out. But those sorts of things, like the hormonal things, are such clickbaity stuff that, and again, like that's the thing too, is all this information that's out there tends to prey on your fear and prey on your anxieties and prey on your uncertainties. And it raises the importance of these issues. And so usually a lot of these places have a lot of things you can buy or purchase, which again, I'm not necessarily inherently against people promoting their services or their products. But at the same time, you have to be cognizant of that too. Like in this space, there's a lot of selling.
Yeah. You and I both have services like for sale. We both have courses. You're working on a book. So it's not to say that that's a bad thing or that it clouds the person's judgment at all. But it's like, I'm going to use an example. So what was it? Maybe a year and a half ago, we did an episode on prokinetics. And I was frothing at the mouth at the time because Dr. Ruscio put several posts, like 4 or 5 posts, all in a row, basically dismissing prokinetics. Like, prokinetics don't work. No, you don't need them for SIBO. Don't bother. No. And then conveniently, his elemental formula went on sale and he started posting that all day, every day, right after that. It's like, oh, I see. That was all part of a thought out campaign to sell more of your shit. And again, I'm not going to judge him for selling an elemental formula. Like, I've heard that it tastes reasonably good and it's worked well for people, but you just have to be aware that everybody on the internet is trying to sell you something, and kind of take it with a grain of salt. And certainly when you see something like an Instagram ad or a Facebook ad or a YouTube ad or a Google ad, they're very much trying to sell. And there are people who study copywriting and sales techniques and like how to make the perfect picture that people click on. And they do a lot of testing on these things. They'll run 10 different versions of an ad and see which one gets the most clicks and the most likes. And it's usually the one that's the most shocking, controversial, inflammatory, or makes the boldest, like insane, totally not doable promises.
Right.
And, it's just, that's how the internet works. I've joked for a long time with my YouTube channel. I know how it works. If I made a video tomorrow and I wanted to go viral, here's what I would do. I would pick some food that most people think is healthy, like spinach, and I could make a video. Top 3 reasons why spinach is killing you.
All right.
It would go nuts. Like
it would
everybody, everybody would lose their mind and it would get all the clicks and the likes and the shares. Meanwhile, if I made the same video, top 3 reasons why spinach is good for you, I would get 2 likes, 10 views, and maybe 1 comment from like a grandma who doesn't know how YouTube works.
Yeah.
It's just,
well, and I think that's a good point too, just to bring up. Trying to be able to assess the quality of the information you're taking in can be really tricky because there's so many different things. And sometimes too, like we disagree with reputable people in the SIBO space. Yeah. Which again, like I'm glad that they're able to share, like I'm very pro like free speech. Like they should be able to share information. And again, we can debate and things like that. But yeah, I mean, I think that there can be a lot of information out there that might be different. And again, maybe it's not evidence-based. And even stuff, again, like SIBO diets, for instance, there's sort of this acceptable discussion around SIBO diets being super helpful for SIBO and starving the SIBO, but there's literally no evidence that it starves the SIBO.
None.
it's so tricky because there's these myths and like, you know, assumptions that are almost promoted as truth or like absolute truth. Again, there could be some studies that contradict that. I don't know. Again, I would be surprised. But again, I'd be open to more information that people would have. But there's no evidence to support that at this time. And I think there's evidence even to the contrary, just understanding how the microbiome works and what bugs are at play with SIBO. But yeah, like to me, it's so tricky because there's so much information out there, and how you're filtering also makes a difference. Because again, if you're taking everything in and like trying to figure it out, what's going to be helpful for you or what's not, like being able to kind of somewhat discern some good sources of information, I think is probably a really good first step too, so that you're like narrowing down a little bit what you're taking in is probably helpful to some degree. And you're not just taking like, you know, Bethany from the SIBO forums advice on what to eat either. You know, that's, I guess, like to the other extreme where it's just some rando on Reddit or something. And not to say that they couldn't potentially have something good to say, but a lot of times there's so much confusions on those forums because it's just confused people that are taking in so much information, that are scared and anxious and sick, not feeling good. And so a lot of times that creates a lot of like information that's also kind of desperate sharing. They're sharing
laced with a lot of fear,
right?
And a lot of like scared. Yeah, you know what you're kind of reminding me of a little bit is remember like in classes where we learned how to appraise research and like read research articles, they would always give us this pyramid, and I forget what they called it, but there was a pyramid where it was basically like the best versus the worst type of research. And it was like, all right, the absolute best of the best would be like a systematic review and meta-analysis, where you are basing that paper off of many different research studies from many different institutions, different researchers, different, you know, levels of bias, whatever. And if all of those people, you know, if 20 people come to the same conclusion that carrots are healthy for you, and they studied it at 20 different universities, 20 different, you know, PIs on the paper, you could be reasonably sure that that statement that carrots are healthy for you is going to be true, right? So like the highest level is going to be systematic review and meta-analysis. Then maybe under that would be like a double-blind placebo-controlled trial on humans. And then below that would be like a non-blinded placebo-controlled trial. And then underneath that would maybe just be like, I forget what they would call it, just like an intervention trial where they don't have a placebo group or they don't have an observation group. They just kind of give it to the people and see what happens. And then maybe, you know, way down at the bottom, you could say like clinical evidence or epidemiological evidence could be a bit lower down on the food chain. But you're kind of painting that idea almost where it's like, all right, down at the very bottom rung of this imaginary ladder or pyramid, like the lowest quality evidence is probably going to be whatever you get in those Facebook groups or the Reddit threads. It's not to say that they are unvaluable. It's not to say that they don't have anything to offer, but you're not going to base the majority of your understanding on the statements from people who they themselves are still sick, they themselves are terrified, they themselves probably have severe disordered eating, because I've seen those groups enough to say that.
Right.
And like they themselves are like frantically scouring the internet for anything, and there's not really a lot of perspective and like clinical insight and like ability to judge quality of evidence. It's just like a frantic free-for-all. So that should be the bottom rung. Then, you know, maybe you would go up to like a SIBO summit or an online summit where they have experts, but they're also very much trying to sell to you at the summits. And then, you know, you could kind of work your way up the ladder and then potentially reading an actual PubMed study yourself, assuming you know how to read research decently well, like that could be higher up on the food chain somewhere. But it's a quirk of the internet. And I forget, I brought this up somewhere. It might have been a FODMAP Freedom Q&A recently. I think one of the problems is that the internet weighs all information the same, right? Like Facebook ads just go to the highest bidder and like the patterns of what you tend to click on. Like Facebook, I mean, on some level, they don't give a crap who is paying for their ad space, as long as they don't blatantly break any of the rules that Facebook has, like they're happy to take the advertisers' money and show you whatever they want. Same thing, for other platforms. They're just happy to get the advertiser money and the revenue from that. But, I think the only thing that can kind of help people understand is what's usually called vanity metrics, right? Like how many subscribers do they have? How many followers do they have? But that's limitedly useful too. There are plenty of big YouTube accounts or big Instagram accounts who are absolutely full of malarkey. So even the vanity metrics doesn't really get you very far. But if I may, I know you might have another comment, but once we wrap this part up, I think let's pivot back to, because I think we've talked about the information side of it and why a lot of the information that people are accruing is probably unhelpful or minimally helpful. But let's pivot back to the idea of taking action and why taking action is so important after you say whatever you want to say.
Yeah, I think I have 2 points and then I agree we can wrap up. So the 1.2 is sometimes when assessing information, one other thing to look out for is anyone that has like a one solution fix. Like I think that can be really
red flag.
A big red flag if someone's like, this is a supplement that fixes everybody with IBS, or if it seems too simple or like too good to be true, probably is most of the time.
You just don't know because you've never tried methylene blue, Amy.
Okay, that's true.
Every single person on planet Earth just needs to be chugging methylene blue, and then that's the cure for all of humanity's ailments. Come on, get with the program.
I'm sorry. That's all I need. So that's one point. The other point that I wanted to make too, and this leads into the action piece, but I do think, like as someone that kind of has more of an anxiety slant and could over-research things, I actually think it makes action harder. And basically the way I would describe it is if you're putting so much pressure on every little strategy that you're doing, I think it actually leads to a lot more anxiety and stress about each piece. So if you're thinking like, oh man, I have to like figure out exactly what foods to eliminate, and that puts so much pressure and like stress on that piece of the puzzle. And again, like I have to figure out which foods to eat or which foods not to eat. You're doing a whole bunch of research on that. The more research you're taking in on what foods to eat or what foods not to eat could actually lead to a lot more food fears and make like discerning what foods work and what foods don't, because you could be operating in more of a sense of like anxiety around the process versus just kind of letting the process flow a little bit more. So, I mean, that's something I found for myself is sometimes if I'm doing so much research on like what to do, it puts a lot more pressure and stress on the actions and actually could, I don't know, make it harder to assess what's working and what's not because there's stress muddying the waters and your ability to kind of discern what's working and what's not working.
Well, it's sort of like, there's like the information overwhelm and you get conflicting points of view. Like there's that side of it. Like, so for nutrition, this influencer says that we should all be vegan, but this person says we should all eat carnivore. This person says we should all do keto. This person says paleo. This person says oxalate, like low oxalate, low histamine. Like, can I be a little bit inappropriate for a sec?
Please.
One of my dad's favorite sayings that I think is really dumb, but funny is opinions are like assholes. Everybody has one.
Yeah, it's true.
It just, everybody has an opinion and they're all too happy to share it with you. And the overwhelm and the confusion leads to difficulty taking action. But then what you were saying kind of made me think of, it's like you're putting all your eggs in a basket or you're raising the stakes. And it's almost like, well, I've been researching the perfect diet for 6 months, so I better get it right.
Right.
Otherwise, those 6 months were in vain.
Right.
And I wasted all that time. So if it's not perfect, I'm like doing myself a disservice.
And I think it raises the importance of that factor too. So like, let's say I have to get this right. This is super important. And again, I think it just confuses the process even more sometimes when there's such high stakes, like you said, and such importance placed on one thing. Yeah.
It makes sense, right? Like, think about an example or two. I think it's a natural instinct that the more time and effort you spend on something, the more important it is or the higher the stakes. So like if you were in college and you had a 3-page paper due for this like little 1-credit class, okay, like it's important, but how important is it really? You could just bang that out in an all-nighter and be done with it. Versus if you were writing your dissertation and you were preparing to defend for your PhD, like, and it's a, 100 or 200 page thing that you're working on, and it's literally like make or break. This is going to decide whether or not you get your degree. Right. That is hugely important, and you'd better be more stressed out about it, and you'd better spend a lot more time on it. So, and there are plenty of other examples, but yeah, the more like time and effort you put into something, it definitely reinforces in your brain, oh, this is really important. This is really critical. I have to get it right. I have to get it right. I have to get it right. So if you're accidentally feeding into that neurological loop by researching and learning all the time and like obsessing about your perfect diet, obsessing over finding the probiotic, the only one that could possibly work for you, like it's going to be really hard when you do try to take action, if you ever do.
Right. And again, like what if that probiotic doesn't work? It's like, are you going to be devastated? Like there's probably more devastation too.
Yeah.
Like you said, because you've spent all that time and energy focusing on this thing. And again, I think that's the other thing too. A lot of these factors, again, you don't need to be perfect, even though, again, like it's sort of promoted as such sometimes too. Like it feeds into that perfectionistic fear. I know I saw an RD recently posting like, we have to be perfectionistic with our diets now. It was like a really weird, I didn't like it. I didn't necessarily agree with it, but it was basically like, we have to be obsessive about our diets now because like we live in a horrible, and it's like, I kind of get the gist. Like we do live in a standard American diet world, but again, I'm like, I don't know if this is the right message to like the health and wellness people that you're talking to.
Well, it's within reason, right? So, for example, for my diet, I would say I eat everything but gluten. Also eggplant. I can't wrap my head around eggplant personally.
That's like the one vegetable I actually don't love. There's an eggplant dish that Armand's family makes. It's like a very traditional Persian that I do actually like. But yeah, I agree with you. Eggplant's weird.
Well, anyway, so I eat pretty much everything. And, I would say probably 80-ish% of my diet is pretty healthy. I just recently got into making my own yogurt.
Whoa, huge, look out.
Huge. I know. I love it already. I'm a weekend and I'm obsessed. But, like I'll eat homemade Greek yogurt and like fruits and vegetables, and I'll get like chickpea pasta and make chickpea pasta and like meat and seafood. I try to eat healthy most of the time, but I also have a big bag of potato chips in my pantry.
Right.
And I don't judge myself in the least bit for eating some potato chips or having ice cream or eating something that I really enjoy. And, I'm not going to lose sleep over it. So I guess to go back to the thing that you just said, to a standard American person, I probably do look like I'm obsessed with my diet, right? Like when I go and visit family in Buffalo, they are much more standard American eaters, like lots of simple carbs, soda, candy, ice cream, like lot more junky food, frankly, and not very many fruits and vegetables and healthy things. So by contrast, like they probably look at me as this health obsessed health nut person. But I'm not. I'm actually pretty laid back about my diet. And I definitely like let my kid eat way more ice cream when we visit cousins in Buffalo.
Right.
It's like I'm pretty chill. So it's a continuum versus the people like I've talked about before, the naturopaths who I would attend the environmental health symposium with, and they refused to go to a restaurant unless it was certified 100% organic. And then even when they got to the restaurant, they would ask, like, is this beef grass-fed and grain finished, or is it 100% grass-fed? And they'd just be anal assholes the whole time. And, like, it wasn't fun to eat with them. So, yes, like, probably standard American people who are completely ignorant to all things health, like, yeah, they probably need to move over to what they think is, like, health nut obsessive kind of like they need to learn more about their nutrition and they need to give more of a
Right.
shit. But you don't need to. Most of the people that are receiving those messages and following these people on Instagram are already pretty deeply entrenched in the world of health and wellness and supplements. So you take those people and then encourage them to obsess more and throttle things down more. And now you're creating disordered eating and orthorexia.
Right.
So it's,
It's
that
tricky.
messaging could be great if it was targeted at the right group of people, but we know damn well who's going to be receptive to
Right.
those messages, and
Right.
they don't need that message.
But yeah, I know we were thinking too about, in terms of action, like what is, you want to acquire like enough information to where I think you feel confident making certain decisions. Like I do think some information is
Or you
very
just
useful.
feel capable, maybe?
Right.
Because confident suggests that you need to like be confident this is the right thing.
Right. I think you need to feel good about the path you're going down. I don't think that necessarily guarantees that it's going to be like the thing that works or that like
Free
this
of
is the strategy. It's like, oh no, we're going to start here and then we're going to learn as we go. And like I said a little bit at the beginning when we were kind of introing this topic, like this is the action part. Like you were saying before, you might actually be doing way more learning than even the researching or information part of this process.
If you're open-minded.
Right, exactly. And again, I think that that's where the mentally flexible approach comes in, because even if you did, like I said, even if you did all the research and crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's, we don't know how these interventions are going to affect you. There is, again, like definitely research that shows hypnosis helps with IBS. And I think for a lot of people, it could help. Now, that might not be the strategy that pushes the needle for you, but maybe it's something you try and see if it works. And if it's something that doesn't seem to push the needle, like maybe you need to assess something else.
Yeah, you pivot.
Right, you pivot. So again, I think having the mentally flexible mindset also helps you assess better. We were alluding to earlier how some of like the pressure and the fear around the importance of the decisions that you're making can actually like muddy your ability sometimes too to assess like what I should do. A lot of times, I spent 6 months researching. I got to keep doing this. This is something that I think is the best diet. And even if it's not working, I think we get stuck sometimes like with a mentally rigid mindset if you do too much research and have put too much investment into something.
Well, again, it's like you're wearing blinders.
Right.
And you can't see the thing that's right there next to you. I'll give an example if I may. And this kind of loops in with what we talked about previously about gathering information. And it also loops back to our episode about the truth about functional medicine. And one of the things we talked about is that functional testing in particular kind of sucks really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And we probably shouldn't be putting a lot of our eggs in that basket. And name a functional test, and I probably have a problem with it at this point, honestly. It's not just limited to the GI map.
This could be a
folks.
Fun game.
No,
I'm just kidding.
We don't have time. Another day, Amy, another day.
I know, I'm just kidding.
No matter what the test is, but my point is, just because something came back on a test doesn't mean that's your thing. So I had a guy who worked with me, and right out the gate, I told him and his wife, I actually think this is much more of a neuro case, and I wanted him to go to functional neuro, but they insisted. They wanted to work with me. They had watched me online for years. They thought I was the one. Okay. So we embarked on working together, and at the time I was ordering GI maps, don't anymore, and I saw the highest amount of Pseudomonas I've ever seen. It was like 10,000 times the limit given by the GI map company. And I was like, whoa, okay, well, let's try to treat that, shall we? So we went about treating that with herbs and, biofilm disruptors, whatever it might have been. And he did not feel any better whatsoever. But we thought, all right, well, we're done with the antimicrobials. Let's go ahead and redo the GI map at least. It was gone.
Yeah.
We had licked it, supposedly, unless the GI map the first time was incorrect, which I wouldn't be surprised by. But assuming that the tests were both accurate and true, he had a raging infection of Pseudomonas, and then we got rid of it, And it didn't change his symptoms at all. So, it's like just because you find something on a test, that doesn't mean that that's what's causing your symptoms. That might be what they call an incidental finding, and it may or may not be doing anything to you. Same thing, like just because your oat test says that you have candida, that doesn't actually guarantee that candida is the cause of your symptoms. What you need to do is you need to make an attempt at treating the candida and see if it moves the needle or if it changes your symptoms. And then if the first round doesn't work, maybe you try a different anti-candida protocol or antimicrobial. But at some point, if you believe that you have candida and you've tried 3 different protocols for candida and you've just been told, wow, you have a really stubborn case. At some point, you've got to start to question, maybe I don't have freaking candida and maybe the test is incorrect. Or if I do have candida, maybe it's not doing anything bad to me as far as symptoms go, and maybe it's just an incidental finding.
Right.
Just because it's on paper doesn't mean much.
Right. Exactly. And again, I think that sometimes providers also, will put the seeds in your head of like, oh,
test, don't guess.
Right. And this is uber important, or the diet is uber important. You have to do it this particular way. But yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to taking action, like you said, these should be viewed as like mini experiments. I think having a good starting point that you feel good about, that like you have enough information to go off of, makes total sense. But then, you have to give the experiments a little time, which is another thing that's also important when we're talking about taking action, is sometimes as humans, we want things to go very fast and we don't give things enough time. We've talked about this before, but in the book Atomic Habits, he talks about it as the valley of disappointment, when you start changing a habit and you don't necessarily notice any positive benefits. And it takes a little bit of time usually to where you're going to start experiencing positives. And again, sometimes you can even experience weird changes in how you're feeling too. That could be transitory, such as adding foods in and feeling a little more gas or a little more bloating or something like that.
Or like you start working out in hopes of losing weight and you're weightlifting and you actually gain a couple of pounds of muscle and the scale goes up initially before you get the long-term benefit of losing weight.
Right.
It's
exactly.
Like you might have a setback, so to speak, before you get the gain, and that might be okay, but you still need to take action.
Yeah, for sure. And again, I think that that's something that maybe you have to assess when you're implementing different things, is like, how much time do I give this particular experiment? Like, what makes sense? Dietary changes can take time depending on what you're hoping to achieve too. Like sometimes I'll work with people that are wanting their sex hormones to shift. And it's like, well, that's going to probably take the longest amount of time typically, because it's such a downstream hormone that's like basically reading off of other hormones and trying to assess like, do you have enough nutrition? Sometimes that takes time for the body to feel confident and comfortable to like get sex hormones back online again from nutritional changes. Well, so something like that might take more time. Something like, just feeling a little bit more balanced, like blood sugar wise, might be a shorter period of time. Changing macros around a little bit, you might notice positive shifts in a week or two. Being able to assess like how much time to give certain strategies really, I think, is important too, so that you can experiment and like learn the most from your experiments. Because again, if you are going too quickly or expecting fast results and it's something that's going to take a little bit longer, it could confuse you and you might miss certain things that are really important.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to bring up another metaphor that I've used in the past. And if you guys want more info on this, I do have videos on my YouTube channel and posts on my Instagram about this. You might have to go a little bit back though, but it kind of reminds me of the cliff metaphor in a way, where if you are standing on 2 feet on solid ground up at the top of the cliff, anywhere on the top of the cliff, you are feeling good. You have no symptoms. You're doing okay.
Right.
So no bloating, no migraines, whatever. When you fall off the cliff and you're hanging on by your fingernails, that's a representation of you not feeling well. So maybe you have an IBS flare or a SIBO flare or whatever. Oftentimes we are really, really good at assessing symptoms versus no symptoms, right? Like, I'm off the cliff, I'm up top. I'm off the cliff, I'm up top. Diarrhea, no diarrhea. We're really good at that, but we suck at assessing our resiliency and the distance from the edge of the cliff. So what can happen is like people, again, we want that quick kind of instant gratification-y kind of stuff. And sometimes we do get it, right? Like maybe somebody with diarrhea is here and then they take, I don't know, like a prebiotic or a motility agent or something, and they get their feet back under them. And they're like, oh, sweet Jesus, hallelujah, I'm cured. I don't have IBS anymore. Hooray. And then they go off all their supplements or they do something huge. And then, because they didn't realize that they were teetering on the edge there.
Right.
So again, it's yet another reason why you have to be patient and diligent. And you need to overcome this shared brain lesion that we all have. Just because you introduced a new supplement yesterday, that doesn't mean you're going to feel better today or even this week. It might genuinely take several weeks or even a month to notice a tremendous difference. Or like just because you changed your diet, that doesn't mean that you're going to feel that much different immediately. You really have to give it enough time to actually take effect and hopefully listen to your body along the way. I do want to share one more idea about that though before we wrap up.
I have one other thing too.
Okay.
It might be a little different than what you're going to say. I was just going to add one last comment on the idea of timing. There's also some people that do things for too long. So like, again, restricting your diet, if it's not helpful and you haven't necessarily, again, you're kind of in a hole and don't feel good, like start adding some food in. Or again, if you've been treating the SIBO for forever with antimicrobials, like, and you're not getting better, you need to bag that.
Very valid point.
So again, I think that some people don't do things long enough. And then there's other people that are doing the same thing over and over again because it feels maybe comfortable or like they kind of know what to expect, or they just think that they should be on it long term too. And so that's something to think about too.
I feel like a lot of those folks have frankly been brainwashed, right? Like the people who like low FODMAP never worked for them, they don't feel any different, but their practitioner scared the willikers out of them and told them that if they even look cross-eyed at a piece of broccoli, they're going to feed the SIBO and bring it back. Right. Or like, oh, I don't even know if this digestive enzyme is helping me, but my naturopath insisted that I have to stay on it forever. Like, I think oftentimes those people stay stuck in one particular action because they've been told to do so, and they frankly have been scared or brainwashed into doing it. But you're right, like maybe it's a comfort thing and like changing their diet seems scary and it feels more comfortable to just stay where they're at, even if their diet kind of sucks. Yeah, I think that is a valid point because you're right. There are certainly people who try like a new supplement every day and they're like, I don't understand why my body's feeling so bad. It's like, you're overwhelming your body and you can't possibly get data in that short amount of time. But yeah, there are the people who are like, oh, I've been low FODMAP for 3 years. Does it help you? No, I don't think so.
Right.
Why are we here?
Right.
And again, on the idea of taking action and observing your body and kind of like collecting data from that experience and how you're going to learn through that process. There is, however, a fine line that I find a lot of our people cross. On the one hand, you don't want to be like Mr. or Mrs. Oblivious and like you eat 3 donuts and a big ice cream and have a massive blood sugar crash and feel exhausted and like you don't know why. Right. Like you don't want to be that person. Please pay attention to your body a little bit more than that. But also, you don't want to be the person who has so much anxiety and fear and knowledge, quote unquote, in your head that you start to freak out about things like, and basically create problems that don't necessarily really exist. Right. So like there are plenty of people out there that we have worked with where, you know, maybe we encourage them to introduce some carbs and then they come back and they're like, oh, but then I felt X, Y, and Z symptom. And like, I don't know, I think that the carbs are really bad. And this also has oxalates. And I think I felt a twinge in my right kidney and it's probably the oxalate. And it's like, whoa. So again, I think that there's a fine line between observing your body enough to gather information, but not over observing and like doing too many body scans and doing too many symptom check-ins. Like at some point, enough is enough. And you need to like just live your life and not obsess over how your body is feeling. And again, I find that that is a line that most of our people either cross over or are really straddling when we work with them. I don't have the luxury of working with the people who eat 3 donuts, have a blood sugar crash, and have no idea what's going on.
Right.
I haven't worked with one of those people.
Exactly what's going on.
I haven't seen one of those people in a lot of years. Right. I tend to see the people who are like, well, I ate a banana and then my nose runs. I think I have mast cell activation disorder. But do you? Like,
yeah. Well, and again, I always think that some people can become a prisoner to the tracking, where it's like, oh man, I'm like really boxing myself into a hole because I'm tracking so intensely, or like you said, symptom scanning or whatever it is. But what it reminds me of is our conversation with Michelle Cavanaugh that we had about anxiety. It's like, okay, you are trying a new food and then you're magnifying your body and you're magnifying every reaction and every sensation. And so again, like you experience the sensations, like there a lot of times I think you can have pain, you can have like more symptoms because you're in kind of a sensitized, magnified state. And it can be super confusing, like you said. And I agree. Like, I think one thing that might help practically when we're thinking about, okay, how do I track progress then, is to think about more of like, oh, I'm going to check in. Like, I'm going to change my diet and maybe check in like a couple weeks. Or like, I'm going to like have more versus like checking after each meal. Like, I think sometimes that's where it gets a little dicey. It's like, okay, first off, like in an experiment, you want to repeat the experiment to see if it's like an actual thing, because there's conflicting variables. There's so many conflicting variables in the day-to-day. You know, you could have had a stressful drive and then immediately ate a meal. But if you're so locked into the like, oh, it's the banana that I ate versus the stressful drive, that could have created the issue. Or just even like having like some anxiety about adding the banana in. You know, I think it can create a lot of problems. So I almost think sometimes when you're adding some stuff in, I'd almost give it more time, because again, there can be reintro weirdness that happens. Sometimes, again, I'll have people even check in and like, I check in with people usually every 2 weeks, but sometimes there's things I'm like, let's just like check in a month, because we want to give your body some time to adjust. And like, if you're assessing or checking after each meal, it's just not going to be beneficial. It's probably going to stress you out more, give you more anxiety, instead of just kind of acknowledging there could be some like squirreliness or like some changes while you're adjusting your diet. So just something to think about. So like, maybe I think it's okay to like check in and see like, okay, how am I progressing? Or I changed something. How is this working for me? But if you're doing that after like each meal or in between meals, or like constantly scanning for bloating, like that's not helpful. It's usually like, I think if you give it a longer period of time and more kind of like loose data points, like through that time period, you're going to be able to assess how you're actually doing without fear, and giving something more time so that you can kind of see how adjustments went versus kind of judging on something that could just be like, oh, weird, I haven't had a potato in a year and I just had a potato and that felt weird. It's like, oh, no wonder.
Of course it did.
Right.
Your body doesn't even remember potatoes anymore. Like, you have to get reacquainted. And again, like going back to the spectrum I talked about, it's like the people on the one side who could eat 3 donuts, have a blood sugar crash and not know, they're doing 0 check-ins with their body per year. The people we work with are doing like a check-in every hour, or it's just a constant scanning up and down.
Right.
So we're proposing maybe meet somewhere in the middle and maybe, you know, do an intervention or do a thing, give your body some time to acclimate to it and like recognize these foods and learn how to digest these foods properly, and then maybe check in a few weeks. And again, it's very analogous to the weight loss world. If you exercised once, you wouldn't be the dummy who gets on the scale immediately, right? Like, I hope not. And you wouldn't expect anything to change even if you did, right? I mean, I know we all kind of have the same brain lesion, so we totally have done this before. But if you start a new exercise routine, or if you start, you know, dieting in hopes of weight loss, it would be much more practical to get on the scale maybe like 2 weeks from now. And then another 2 weeks from now, and maybe do like 2 weigh-ins per month instead of obsessing over every little fraction of a pound that goes up and down.
Right.
Because maybe you didn't have a good bowel movement one day and you are literally full of shit, and that's why you weigh more. Or maybe you hydrated poorly and you're shriveled up into a dried out sponge, and that makes you look like you're light as a feather. Or, maybe you're wearing more clothes, or you get the idea, right? There are a lot of reasons why you could fluctuate even a couple of pounds from day to day, versus if you check in every couple of weeks with your weight, you're more likely to get usable information.
100% agree.
All right. Well, Amy, I think we've said all there is to say on this topic. Perhaps not, though. If you think we're wrong, if you have more to weigh in, go ahead and comment on the YouTube video down below. We do occasionally check on the comments, at least I do anyway. So I'll look forward to reading those comments, and we will see you right back here for another rip-roaring episode of the IBS Freedom Podcast. Until then, toodaloo.